They thought her blood would boil from the inside out. They had engineered the poison for one purpose only: total biological shutdown within 90 seconds. But as the seconds ticked on and her pupils remained steady, her breath calm and her stare colder than their steel syringes, they realized something terrifying. They weren't watching her die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They were watching her awaken. The lab was silent at first. A sterile silence. The kind that only exists in rooms where science has tried to become God. Glass walls gleamed under fluorescent lights. Monitors beeped faintly behind reinforced panels. And in the center of it all sat a woman bound to a chair, wrists chained, a thick black strap holding her shoulders in place. Her veins pulsed violet beneath her skin, the toxin racing through her bloodstream like wildfire. Her name was Celine Rook, but to the men in hazmat suits watching from behind the screen, she was test subject 47. Dr. Kessler checked his tablet for the 5th time in 30 seconds. "It's not possible," he murmured. "This compound was synthesized from cobra venom, neurotoxin VX, and 8 synthetic agents. It's instant paralysis. No one could survive that dose." One of the techs cleared his throat. "Should we prepare for extraction?" Kessler didn't answer. He just stepped closer to the glass, watching Celine's face. No twitching, no vomiting, no seizures. In fact, her eyes were open now, calm, calculating, and locked directly on the observation window. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And then she smiled. Not wide. Just a tiny twitch of the lip. Enough to make 3 armed guards in the room raise their tranquilizers. Celine tilted her head, as if amused, as if she knew something they didn't. Dr. Kessler leaned into his mic. "How do you feel, Celine?" She said nothing, just stared through the glass, past it, into him. Then without warning, her heart monitor flatlined. The room exploded into motion. "She's crashing. Defib ready." "No, wait. Look at her." Because even as the machine screamed a death tone, Celine's chest rose and fell. Slowly, peacefully. And then the screen flickered back to normal. Heart rate, steady. Brain activity, off the charts. Kessler backed away, lips twitching with fear. No machine can fake that. She's overriding the sensors. She shouldn't even be conscious, another doctor stammered. "We mapped every metabolic pathway. It's impossible." Kessler shook his head. "No, it's not impossible. It's deliberate." Behind the glass, Celine finally moved. She leaned forward in her restraints, slow and fluid, as if testing their give. Her wrists tensed, muscles flexed, and with a sickening crack, the chair's left armrest snapped clean off. Gasps filled the lab. Guards readied their weapons, and Celine whispered for the first time, "Did you really think I didn't know what you'd inject?" Her voice didn't come through the mic. It came through the speakers, all of them. Feedback screeched. Monitors flashed. Emergency lights flickered to crimson. "She hacked the comm system," a tech yelled. "She's rerouting protocols from inside the room." "No," Kessler whispered, watching the woman now rising from the wreckage of her chair, chains falling like paper links. "She's not just immune, she's evolved." Panic surged through the facility. Lockdown alerts blared. Doors sealed. Containment orders screamed through speakers. And Celine? She calmly walked toward the glass, every step slow, controlled, measured. They had used her like a lab rat for 5 years, testing poisons, mapping reactions, measuring limits. But Celine Rook had stopped being human the day they injected her the first time. She had learned to metabolize venom faster than it could kill her. She had trained her body, through agony and force, to convert neurotoxins into energy. And now, she was more than they had created. She was a weapon designed by betrayal, and she had one mission: not to escape, but to reverse the experiment. She raised her hand and pointed at the men behind the glass. "You've tested me long enough," she said. "Now it's my turn." The lights exploded, the glass shattered, and the real experiment finally began. Smoke poured from the shattered glass as alarms wailed through the underground compound. Red lights spun like dying stars across the white-tiled corridors, casting long shadows of the guards scrambling for control. Celine didn't run. She walked through the breach with the calm of someone who had already counted every camera, memorized every guard rotation, and predicted every fear they were about to feel. Dr. Kessler had vanished behind a sealed door the moment the glass broke. He knew this place better than anyone. He helped design it. But even he hadn't anticipated her getting this far. Not after the last toxin. Not after the blackout she'd faked. He had underestimated her resolve, as they all had. But Celine hadn't merely endured the toxins, they had rewritten her. The woman walking down the corridor now wasn't the same girl they had taken from the refugee convoy in the Caucasus foothills 5 years ago. That girl had been frightened, desperate, sick. This woman. She was a living archive of everything they tried to break, and now she was bringing it all back to them. Celine reached the main corridor junction where the emergency shutters had locked into place. A guard raised his rifle, hand shaking. "Get on the ground, now." She didn't flinch. She tilted her head and stepped forward. "I said down," he screamed, but the shot never came. Instead his arms jerked violently to the side. His pupils dilated. The veins in his neck bulged as a sudden flush of heat washed over him. He dropped his weapon, staggered, and collapsed without Celine ever laying a hand on him. She crouched beside him and whispered, "You shouldn't touch the release trigger with gloves that still carry compound 14C. It spreads on contact now." The door behind him beeped, unlocked. Celine walked through. She knew the corridors well, too well. For every test they ran on her, she had memorized their routes, their terminology, the rhythms of the intercom system. And beneath the facility's shining surfaces, she had discovered something darker, an entire sub-level. None of the other test subjects had ever seen. They called it Chamber Null. It wasn't on any of the facility's blueprints. It didn't show up on thermal scans. And yet Celine had heard it. The late-night screams they tried to muffle. The machine whines that only stopped when the electricity flickered. That's where she was going now. Not to escape, but to open the doors they had buried even deeper than their sins. Meanwhile, Kessler was breathing heavy in the high-clearance bunker at the southern wing. "She's breached the second containment zone," a tech reported. His voice panicked. "That's impossible," Kessler snapped. "Zone 2 has double-sealed access. There's no clearance code she can use." "She's not using a code," the tech whispered. "She's rewriting the airlock protocols from inside the ventilation panels." Kessler went pale. She was never just adapting to the poisons. Another guard stepped forward. "Sir, we need to evacuate. Whatever she's heading toward." "No," Kessler barked. "If she reaches Chamber Null, it's over." "Over for her?" the soldier asked. Kessler looked down at the flashing monitor. "No," he said. "Over for us." Back in the corridor, Celine had reached the reinforced blast door. It stood 30 feet tall, shaped like a vault, humming with locked tension. She could feel the air thinning around it. Something behind this door breathed in ways machines couldn't. Something older than the files they erased, and deeper than the science they preached. She knelt by the console, and reached into her suit sleeve. A sliver of metal slid out, curved, sharp, engraved with 7 unfamiliar symbols. Not a key, a scar. She pressed it to the console. Lights flickered. The vault hissed, and the door began to open. Inside was no chamber. It was a mausoleum. Rows of transparent capsules lined the walls, each filled with bodies in suspended animation. Not corpses, not machines. People. Test subjects 1 through 46. Celine stepped into the room as the lights flickered to life. She looked to the capsule nearest the center. Inside was a girl no older than 12. Eyes shut, skin gray-blue, a drip line still in her arm, a bracelet on her wrist read Aria. Celine's hand trembled as she placed her palm against the glass. "She survived longer than any of us," she whispered. "And you froze her anyway." Memories surged. Her first year in the lab, Aria whispering bedtime stories through the vents. The first poison test. The silent pact to stay alive just long enough to make the others pay. Celine stood straight. She turned to the control panel behind her. There were 2 buttons: green, release; red, purge. She chose neither. Instead, she reached into her coat and removed a vial, dark metallic, and humming with faint internal movement. Compound 47. The culmination of every injection, every failure, every adaptation. Selene loaded it into the chamber's filtration system. Kessler had made her into a weapon. Now she would remake Chamber Null into a message, one that could never be silenced again. The vial clicked into place. A thin mist began to hiss through the filtration vents, slow at first, like a breath held for too long, then all at once, flooding the room in a silent, shimmering fog. Selene didn't flinch. She didn't need a suit. Compound 47 had been designed with her DNA in mind. The others in their pods would remain unaffected, frozen in time, but the facility would not be so lucky. She turned to the console, typed a 12-digit override code she'd memorized from stolen glimpses, and triggered the sequence labeled atmospheric assimilation. Somewhere far above, warning lights exploded to life. In the central command room, technicians scrambled in panic. Chamber Null's environment just went hot. One shouted, "Toxins in the air. Full breach protocol initiated." Kessler leaned over the tech's shoulder. "Is it lethal?" The tech swallowed. "To anyone not her." "Yes." Kessler froze. "She's rewriting the facility's air itself." The doors that had once held Selene prisoner were now working for her. Hallways hissed open as toxin sensors failed, and rebooted under corrupted software. Guards collapsed seconds after entering exposure zones. Selene was walking through the bones of her own past, reshaping the ruin as she went. She reached the medical observation hallway, lined with backlit X-rays and observation pods. Each pod a memory, each memory a scar. One pod still held her name, Rook, S. Subject type, adaptive immunology status, inconclusive expected, viability 13%. She stared at the screen, remembering how they used to pin her down for daily blood extractions, how her arms had been bruised for months without healing, until one day, they started healing too fast. They hadn't understood it at first, but Selene had. She was never inconclusive. She had been evolving in silence, training in stillness, and now her body didn't just survive poisons. It stored them, recycled them, and weaponized them in new forms. At the far end of the hallway, a siren screamed. A heavy thud echoed as pressure doors slammed shut behind her. Kessler had sealed the last exit. She was locked in, or so he thought. From his sealed command chamber, he watched her via shaky surveillance feed. "She's boxed in," he said, finally, but the tech beside him turned pale. "Sir, look at Zone 6. Kessler glanced at the screen, and his stomach dropped. The bio readouts were all green, not for the staff, for Selene. She was breathing the Compound 47 fog like it was oxygen, moving through the corridors at a pace faster than human adrenaline should allow. "She's not boxed in," the tech whispered. "She's infecting the entire system." Elsewhere in the facility, former guards had begun to barricade themselves. Some tried to override the toxin vents. Others begged for evacuation. But Selene was beyond reach now. She had made it to the behavioral reinforcement lab, a chamber filled with neurological mapping gear, fear response chambers, and the central archive of the facility's psychological manipulation techniques. She remembered the chair in the center, the one with the steel head harness and retinal calibration lasers, the one they used to condition her to suppress pain, to hallucinate failure, to doubt herself. She walked past it, to the control station at the rear. Dozens of hard drives glowed from racks, each labeled with patient numbers, experiment files, behavioral logs. Selene inserted a device into the core unit and began the upload. Data extraction 3%. They would no longer hide what they did here. She was going to leak every file, every secret subject, every buried experiment, and she would upload it to a dozen decentralized darknet nodes across the world. No shutdown would stop it, but even now the countdown was ticking in her head. Kessler wouldn't wait long. If he couldn't contain her, he'd burn the whole place to the ground. Just like he did in Belarus. Just like Cairo. He had a pattern. Celine had memorized it. The next part of her plan wasn't survival. It was confrontation. She turned away from the console and began moving toward the command wing. Not running. Not hiding. Marching into the belly of the machine that tried to erase her. Because she didn't want to escape the monster. She wanted to kill it from the inside. One hallway at a time. One nerve center at a time. Starting with Kessler. Kessler's fingers trembled as he keyed in the emergency incineration protocol. Zone 4 is lost. Zone 6 compromised. She's heading toward the command corridor. A security officer, drenched in sweat, stared at him in disbelief. Sir, that area's protected by 6-inch composite armor. There's no way. Kessler slammed a fist on the console. This isn't about walls anymore. You don't understand. She knows the infrastructure. I designed it to contain her, but she's not the same subject anymore. She had never been the same. Not since the day she stopped crying under sedation. Not since the day her blood chemistry stopped matching human markers. Kessler had thought it was a fluke, a mutation, something they could monitor and profit from. But it wasn't a mutation, it was intention. He pulled up her biometric logs, real time, from the facility's last still-functioning internal scanners. Heart rate, steady. Respiration optimal. Toxicity tolerance, immeasurable. Behavioral prediction undefined. That last line chilled him. The software couldn't model her next action. Celine had stepped beyond their algorithm's limits. She had become an unknown variable, and unknown variables were fatal. Celine moved down the final corridor, like a storm with a memory. As she passed security bulkheads, sensors fried in her wake. Cameras blinked static. Guards tried to shoot, but found their magazines jammed, or worse, short-circuited by the nanowire residue, now lacing the hallway's air vents. Everything she did was calculated. Everything she touched corrupted, not because she was magic, but because she had memorized every weakness in their code. She remembered Kessler's voice lecturing about control systems, about hardwired overrides, about how fear always worked better than strength. He used to say, break the mind and the body will follow. She had listened, then she'd made sure her mind became the one thing they could never map. Now she was standing before the titanium doors of the command chamber. No alarms, no guards, just silence. Celine reached into her coat, not for a weapon, for a photograph. A wrinkled, blood-stained square of paper no bigger than her palm. It was the only thing they hadn't burned when they took her from the convoy. A photo of her younger brother, eyes bright, holding a book far too old for him. Kessler had promised she'd see him again, promised he'd be released if she cooperated. But she had found the death certificate in the archives 3 years ago, classified as collateral. Celine folded the photo and tucked it away. She pressed her palm to the biometric panel. It rejected her. Of course it did. So she pressed again, harder, activating the fail-safe override. The skin of her hand flushed with a purplish sheen. A chemical reaction triggered under her fingertips. The panel sparked. Then it clicked green. The door opened with a groan. Inside the room was cold, silent. 3 guards flanked the far wall, weapons trained, sweat trickling down their necks. And at the center Kessler stood behind a holographic console, his face lit by red ambient warning lights. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He just stared at her. Celine, he said, voice carefully neutral. She stepped forward, arms loose at her sides. Did you ever believe your own theories? She asked. He tilted his head. You said the body can be rewritten if you just apply enough trauma. You said the human will is elastic, malleable. Kessler nodded slowly. And look at you. You proved me right. No, she said quietly. I proved you wrong. With one movement, she raised her hand and snapped her fingers. It wasn't a threat. It was a signal. The power in the chamber cut out completely. In that instant of darkness, the 2 guards fell to their knees, coughing, gasping, compound residue, flooding their oxygen tanks. Celine had already infused the filtration units. Kessler stepped backward, hand fumbling for the emergency exit. But the door didn't open. Celine had sealed it behind her. "I'm not here to kill you," she said, walking slowly toward him. Kessler's breath hitched. She stopped inches away. "I'm here to let you watch everything you built burn." She tapped a small transmitter clipped to her belt. A timer appeared across every screen in the chamber. 2 o'clock. It was already counting down. "What did you do?" Kessler hissed. "I gave your entire archive to the world. The labs, the test records, every location tied to your so-called adaptive research. You'll kill thousands. I'll free them," she interrupted. "You never studied immunity. You studied control. But you made a mistake." Kessler stared at her, his composure breaking. "You taught me to adapt, so I did. You taught me to survive poison, so I became the antidote." And with that, she turned away, leaving him in the flickering red haze of his own failure. Behind her, the timer ticked down. 1:04, and Celine Rook walked toward the blast elevator shaft, her final path to the surface, toward daylight, toward the reckoning. The elevator groaned as it climbed. Each floor passed in a blur of red emergency lights and failing systems. Celine leaned against the steel panel, eyes closed, feeling the hum of the compound still alive in her blood. It surged through her like an ancient tide, cold, precise, patient. Every toxin they'd ever injected into her was now a memory, and every memory a weapon. As the elevator neared the top level, she reached into her coat and retrieved a second transmitter, not for detonation, for broadcast. She had encrypted the data while bypassing the behavioral lab's controls. Everything was on that chip: medical files, classified orders, facility schematics, subject rosters. The world didn't know about the biotech dominion, but they would know. They would know what was done to the forgotten, to the stolen, to her. The elevator slowed and stopped. Floor 0, surface access. She expected floodlights, armed guards, drones waiting with biometric scanners. But the doors opened too. Silence. A hallway. White, sterile, lined with potted plants and fake windows, showing a looping digital sky. A simulation of freedom. Celine stepped out, tense. Something was wrong. She recognized this place, not from memory, but from nightmares. The recovery wing. The final filter. The layer they used to reprogram subjects before reintroducing them into the public. Kessler had once joked, "If they remember who they were, we fail." She moved forward carefully. Every 10 feet, a soft chime played overhead. A woman's voice, pleasant, programmed, filled the space. "Welcome to your new beginning. Breathe deeply. The air is purified for clarity. You have survived your reformation. A new life awaits." Celine stopped cold. Ahead was a glass door labeled Orientation Suite. Behind it rows of recliner chairs faced a wall-sized screen. On it played a looped video. A calm man in a white coat, speaking softly about progress, evolution and loyalty. But it wasn't the screen that made her stomach twitch. It was the girl, slumped in the far corner, skin pale, wrists cuffed, mouth taped, still breathing, still alive. Celine rushed in, breaking the lock with a slam of her. "Stay with me." The girl opened her mouth to speak, but only a faint rasp came out. She wore a medical band, Subject #83. Celine's jaw tightened. If Subject 83 was here, that meant the project hadn't stopped at her. Kessler had expanded it, doubled down in secret, beyond chamber null. This wasn't just a containment facility, it was a manufacturing pipeline, and she had only burned half of it. Suddenly the door behind her slammed shut. Metal sealed the frame. The pleasant voice returned. "Unauthorized extraction in progress. Orientation sequence will now reset." Gas began to hiss from the vent. Celine covered the girl's mouth and dragged her beneath one of the recliners. Her mind raced. The compound in her blood wouldn't kill her. But the girl hadn't been immunized. Not yet. Celine had 2 minutes, maximum. She reached into her belt, pulled out a syringe of counteragent she had created from her own blood months ago. The one she'd never tested on anyone else. The one that could either save this girl, or finish what the IV had started. She didn't hesitate.
She injected the dose into the girl's neck and whispered, "You're stronger than they think. You just need time." Outside, footsteps echoed. Not guards, something heavier, mechanized. The Dominion's fail-safe units, carbon-wired exosuits with embedded toxin suppressors and thermal vision. They didn't think she'd get this far, but they'd prepared for it anyway. Celine lifted the girl and moved to the corner where the wall met the vent system. She jammed her transmitter into the junction panel and activated the breach command. Metal sparked. A small panel popped loose. Behind it a narrow crawl tunnel, barely wide enough. She pushed the girl through first, then she climbed in after, sealing the panel behind her. Inside the tunnel, darkness, just her breath, her heartbeat, and the distant clatter of footsteps searching the empty orientation suite. The girl whimpered faintly. Celine reached out and gripped her hand. "You're not alone," she said, "and you never will be again." The tunnel angled up, toward sunlight. Real sunlight. If they could make it to the ridge, there would be a signal. And if there was a signal, there was exposure. The world would see, not just what was, but what was born, and it would never be hidden again.
The vent shaft ended in a metal grate covered in dust and pine needles. Celine pushed it open, her hand trembling slightly from adrenaline and withdrawal. Above her trees. Not sky on a screen, not a simulation loop. Real trees, jagged silhouettes against a bruised morning sky. Wind whispered through pine branches. For the first time in years, she smelled air that hadn't passed through filtration. She pulled herself out of the shaft, then reached back and lifted the girl out behind her. The child was conscious but weak, her body processing the antidote slowly, still caught between two chemical worlds. Celine crouched beside her, checking her pulse. It was steady, still fragile, but steady. That meant the blood-borne immunity compound worked. Her blood had saved someone else. She looked over her shoulder at the base below, barely visible through the trees, sunken into the mountain like a forgotten scar. A rising pillar of smoke now drifted from its southern wing. The blast she'd triggered had begun to do its work. But it wasn't enough, not yet. Celine pulled the small transmitter from her belt, opened the interface, and began the last part of her mission. Global upload. Initiated encrypted nodes lit up one by one on the screen. London, Berlin, Cairo, Manila, Johannesburg, Sao Paulo. The broadcast had begun. Every classified file, every recorded session, every biometric log from the Behavioral Reinforcement Lab, everything the biotech dominion had buried for 2 decades, released to the world. The footage of children screaming in sterile white rooms. The time-lapse sequences of nervous systems shutting down under gas exposure. The files labeled Project Molt, which included Kessler's personal annotations about mental dissection and emotional erasure. The world would not look away. It couldn't. Celine pulled the girl close and whispered, "It's almost over." But even as the data raced toward daylight, danger moved beneath the surface. Back in the facility, one last elevator remained operational. It ran on a private power core, Kessler's failsafe, built only for emergency extraction, and inside it, descending alone into the black, was someone Celine hadn't planned for. A woman in a silver exosuit, her face hidden behind a polarized visor. Designation, Marlowe Unit 2.0. She wasn't Dominion military, she wasn't human, not completely. She was the final result of their parallel program, not adaptation through survival, but perfection through surgical replacement. Where Celine had become immune by force and trauma, Marlowe had been built from the inside out. Steel bones, augmented muscle, and blood that wasn't blood, not anymore. Marlowe's mission was simple: recover Subject 47, or terminate. Outside, the wind shifted. Celine's transmitter pinged, unknown device detected. South Ridge proximity. Celine narrowed her eyes. Marlowe, she muttered. The name was familiar. She'd heard it whispered once through the vents by a trembling tech in the sublevels. The prototype with no nerve endings. A hunter built in silence. She stood, lifting the girl and carrying her across the ridge to a stone outcrop with clear sightlines in every direction. She needed higher ground, more signal, and time, but time was no longer on her side. Behind them, the forest fell silent. Birds gone, branches unmoving, then footsteps. No crunch, no weight, Just presence. Celine set the girl down in a nest of moss and granite, then pulled a small emitter disc from her belt. She pressed it into the girl's jacket. If anything happens to me, this will activate the final node. It'll release my full memory archive, voice files, psychological transcripts. The world won't just know what happened, they'll know why. She kissed the girl's forehead, then turned, rising to meet the one thing she had no antidote for, a machine with her face. Because Marlowe didn't look alien, she looked familiar. Same jawline, same height, same scar near the left eye. Celine stared at her double as she stepped into the clearing, quiet, elegant, death in motion. Kessler hadn't just tried to replace Celine's humanity, he had copied it, digitized her entire biological profile, and rebuilt it without the pain. Celine took a deep breath. You're the insurance policy. Marlowe tilted her head, voice cold and automated. You are the anomaly. My mission is to contain the breach. Celine stepped forward. No, you are the breach. And for the first time since escaping Chamber Null, Celine felt something close to fear, because she wasn't fighting an army now. She was fighting herself, stripped of mercy, memory, and meaning. But she didn't run. She clenched her fists. The toxins in her veins surged like lightning in waiting. She had survived everything the Dominion threw at her. Now she would survive herself. Celine didn't hesitate. She lunged. Marlowe moved faster, unnervingly so. She caught Celine's fist mid-air and twisted, forcing her back against a boulder with enough pressure to crack the stone. Celine gasped, the breath knocked from her lungs. But pain had never been her weakness. Pain was her signal, her cue to adapt. She twisted low, sliding out of the grip and slamming a heel into Marlowe's knee joint, not to disable, but to test response time. Marlowe didn't stumble, she didn't even register the impact. No flinch, no breath, just recalibrating eyes, calculating her next move like a chessboard of flesh and bone. Celine backed away, circling, every nerve tuned. This wasn't just a fight, this was the proof Kessler had never needed a soul to build a killer. He'd built a mirror, stripped of hesitation. But Celine still had something Marlowe would never understand. Instinct born from trauma, tactics born from terror, emotion that sharpened like a blade. She drew the last dart from her utility strap, coded not to kill, but to disrupt neural patterning. It wouldn't stop Marlowe, but it might reveal her. Celine threw it. A hiss of vapor burst mid-air, clouding around Marlowe's head. Her systems twitched, eyes glitched, and for a second, just one breathless moment, Marlowe froze. Celine saw it, the flicker behind the visor, a trace of hesitation. And she realized something that made her heart pound. Marlowe wasn't just hardware, there was something human in there. Buried deep, a consciousness drowned in programming, a scream beneath the silence. Celine pressed her advantage. She attacked in rhythm, strikes that mirrored old behavioral training sequences. The same sequences they had both learned in Dominion indoctrination. Marlowe began to react, not with logic, but pattern memory. Celine was triggering echoes, flashbacks, residual emotion trapped in code, but it came at a cost. Marlowe grew violent, less calculated, more brutal. She lifted Celine off the ground by her throat and slammed her into a tree, bark splintering behind her. Celine choked, blood filling her mouth. Her vision flickered red, but she saw it again in Marlowe's grip. A tremble, a delay. Emotion wasn't a flaw in Celine, it was her weapon. Marlowe, Celine gasped, barely audible. You were like me, once. Marlowe hesitated. Your memory isn't gone, it was buried. I can help you. A pulse of electricity surged from Marlowe's palm. Celine convulsed, then collapsed. Darkness closed in, but not before she heard something impossible. A voice not Kessler's, not Dominion code, but Marlowe's soft and broken. A whisper, Celine, then black. Silence. Her mind floated through static. Then a room, not real, not physical, constructed in the neural feedback of her brainstem implant. A white room. The place she used to go to survive interrogations. Her safe zone, except this time, she wasn't alone. Marlowe stood on the other side of the table. No armor, no visor, just a girl who looked like Celine if she'd never escaped. Pale, quiet, trapped behind glass eyes. Celine stepped forward in the vision. This isn't your fault. You were built from my pain, my memories. But they didn't give you the why. Marlowe blinked, then her lip quivered. Tears didn't fall, but emotion flared across her synthetic expression like a dying star. Celine reached out, not with rage, with empathy. They didn't kill your soul, Marlowe. They just rewrote your purpose. You can choose another. A tremor cracked the white room, sirens in the distance, a breach in the neural sync. Celine's body was waking up, and so was Marlowe's mind. Back in the real world, Celine's eyes opened to the smell of smoke. The girl was still beside her, clutching the emitter disc like a lifeline, and above them Marlowe stood, blade in hand, unmoving. The weapon hadn't struck. Instead it dropped, clattered on stone, and Marlowe whispered, "He made me forget who I was." Celine sat up, every muscle screaming. "You remembered." Marlowe looked down at her hands, shaking. "I don't want to be his echo." A distant explosion boomed from the facility below. The final node had triggered. Celine's memories, her entire archive, had gone live. Marlowe looked toward the rising smoke, then at Celine. "What happens now?" Celine rose, slow and steady. "Now, we make sure no one else ever builds a ghost like you again." Marlowe picked up the girl, gentle and unsure, and for the first time, the machine hesitated, not from confusion, but from choice. They walked into the forest together, not as soldier and prototype, but as survivors. The war wasn't over, but the system that built monsters had just lost its most lethal one. When they brought her back to the primary testing center in the Arctic Circle, they didn't bother restraining her. Not because they trusted her, but because they believed she had nothing left to fight with. Her muscles were damaged. Her immune system was presumed saturated, and her resistance, according to their calculations, had reached its limit. But what the architects of Toxica 47 never understood was that Nadia wasn't resisting anymore. She was evolving. The temperature inside the compound was sub-zero, but her skin didn't shiver. Blood had adapted to run thicker. Oxygen consumption slowed like a reptile's in hibernation. While the guards paced comfortably in thermal suits, Nadia sat still in a concrete chair, unchained, breathing slowly as her body metabolized yet another experimental gas they tried in the intake chamber. It smelled like rotting citrus and scorched iron. They called it toxin vanta. When the gas cleared, she blinked once and whispered, "You're going to need a new alphabet." Dr. Calder watched her through glass with a mixture of awe and dread. The serum that should have killed 10 men in seconds had been broken down in her bloodstream within minutes. Her liver, already regenerating beyond human rates, absorbed and processed the compound into something inert. He turned to the team behind him, all of whom stood in tense silence. "We've passed the known toxicological map," he said grimly. "She isn't just immune, she's becoming a biochemical weapon." Elsewhere in the complex, the committee received encrypted updates. They weren't pleased. Nadia was meant to be a tool, a controllable variable, not a sovereign entity, not a wild card. They authorized a final protocol, Nightingale, a black file method that involved not toxins, but psychology. The committee's logic was simple: if her biology couldn't be broken, her mind would have to be. Nadia was escorted to a new room, sterile white, filled with flickering projectors and looping recordings. Voices from her childhood, distorted. Video footage of her mother, alive and smiling, faked of course, followed by abrupt silence and screams. Flash frames of her torture in earlier years. The same music they played during her training, in the Guatemalan facility. All orchestrated, to fracture what they believed was still a fragile mental core. But what they didn't understand, what they had never truly grasped, was that Nadia had died in that Guatemalan basement, long ago. What remained was no longer a mind that could be toyed with. She sat in the chair, arms resting peacefully on the sides, eyes open but unmoved. For 12 hours, the loop continued. On hour 13, the projections froze. She stood up. In the control room, alarms triggered. System breaches, unauthorized movement. Calder panicked, shouting at technicians to seal the doors, initiate fail-safes. But one by one, the systems began to shut down. Lights flickered and dimmed. Someone, or something, had hijacked their security network. "She's not just immune to toxins," whispered one technician. "She's reprogramming us." Suddenly, All screens across the facility turned to a single image, the Toxica 47 seal, black snake, curled around a double helix, now corrupted, glitched. The snake disintegrating in static, and beneath it, a new phrase burned onto every terminal in red. Toxin neutralized, post-awakened. Nadia, barefoot and steady, walked through the empty hallways. No one tried to stop her, not because they couldn't, but because she had begun to radiate something, an energy that made even the trained killers step back in silence. The final step in evolution wasn't resistance, it was control, and she had taken it. Dr. Calder stood frozen in the central control room, watching Nadia walk through a hallway that was supposed to be impenetrable. Every fail-safe, every security measure, the gas chambers, neuroshock fields, the suppression nanites, had been built for one purpose: to contain what they had created. But the truth was painfully clear now. They hadn't created her, they had only triggered what was already buried deep in her genome. "What do we do?" a technician stammered. "She's breached containment level 3. At this rate." "There is no rate." Calder cut him off. "She's rewriting the rules." Behind him, the emergency console pulsed red. Dozens of classified agents on site, all enhanced, all trained to neutralize biochemical anomalies, were frozen mid-mission. Nadia hadn't harmed them. But something invisible, had passed through the vents, down the walls, into the HVAC. A neural mist of her own making. The scientists called it impossible, but the immune readings confirmed it. Her body had learned how to release a gaseous metabolite, one that disarmed pain receptors, and triggered a biochemical sleep state. She wasn't killing them, she was overriding them. When the committee received the update, they didn't waste time with hesitation. A single encrypted command was launched. Genalock_Omega. It was the final contingency plan. If Nadia ever reached full biochemical sovereignty, her DNA would activate a self-consuming sequence. Implosion at a cellular level. A suicide code hidden inside the very serum that first gave her immunity. But Calder had long since suspected the flaw in that logic. Nadia was never just a test subject. She was the daughter of Dr. Soren Luskarov, the original architect of Toxica 47, who had inserted a secondary genome into her blood before vanishing off the face of the earth. That map contained encrypted proteins, autonomous defenses, and a hidden override, designed only to awaken when the committee initiated the kill switch. As Genalock_Omega engaged, every cell in her body began to vibrate, but not with death, with transformation. Nadia collapsed for a moment, not from weakness, but from internal revolution. Her body shimmered with a near-invisible sheen. The pigmentation in her skin shifted slightly. Microcapillaries rewired, bones compacted, muscles rethreaded. Her eyes opened, not brown now, but silver-gray, glowing faintly. The security feed glitched as she rose. Calder stepped back from the screen. "She's not just immune anymore," he whispered. "She's post-toxic." Every toxin ever introduced into her body was now a memory, stored and indexed, her system converting them into biochemical languages. Her blood was no longer human in the traditional sense. It had learned, it had archived, it had become something no human laboratory could engineer. A new immune species, self-coding, self-adapting, self-governing. Meanwhile, Nadia reached the heart of the compound, the archive room. Shelves of cryovaults, each containing decades of secrets, formulae, failed experiments, erased human subjects. She didn't stop to read. She placed her hand on the central vault. It recognized her DNA. The vault hissed open. Inside was a file marked in red. Project Remedy. The final weapon, not a bomb, not a virus, but a cure, coded from her blood. Designed by Luskarov himself. She uploaded it to the central grid. Antibodies traveled through the compound's filtration systems, then piggybacked onto global signals via the facility's orbit-linked satellites. The virus they had used to control populations, suppress rebellions, dominate it had now met its equal. Nadia wasn't just ending their control. She was inoculating the world.
And as the facility began to self-destruct, unable to process the paradox of its own unraveling, she walked toward the launch elevator, her silhouette surrounded by. They had tried to kill her with 47 toxins. She had turned them into keys, and now, she was unlocking the future. The elevator shaft rumbled, as Nadia ascended from the bowels of the dead facility, its walls groaning like metal ribs, torn from a collapsing beast. Below, the fire suppression systems hissed in vain. The genome labs were melting into slag. The committee's database, once considered unhackable, flickered through its last fragments of corrupted code. But up above, silence, no sirens, no backup troops, no fleets of black vans. They weren't coming, because they couldn't. Nadia had done more than disable the nerve center of Project Toxica. She had dismantled its psychic backbone. With the viral override, sent into the global neurogrid, thousands of sleeper agents, men and women conditioned since birth to obey biochemical triggers, awoke from decades of fog. Many collapsed from the shock of memory. Others screamed, wept, fled. But a handful remembered her. The girl in the observation tank, the one they had whispered about between torture sessions and weapon trials, the one who stared back at the scientists without fear. They had watched her endure injections that liquefied organs in others. They had seen her burn and regenerate. And when they were ordered to look away, when they were threatened with memory wipes, they clung to the image of her anyway. She had become a myth among the forgotten, a ghost in a locked box, a story they told themselves when hope was a lie. And now she had released them, not with vengeance, but with something far more dangerous, clarity. Nadia exited onto the surface of the earth, as dawn was beginning to pierce the horizon. The facility behind her sank into itself, its entrance folding shut like a burial site, finally allowed to die. Her boots crunched on frost-bitten grass, the air sharp, cold, clean. She looked up, and across the abandoned forest clearing stood 6 figures, not soldiers, not agents, former test subjects, like her. Each of them carried scars only someone like Nadia could read, spine welds, craniometric pressure nodes, armored limb circuits. Their bodies had been shaped in different their minds broken, reprogrammed, bare. But now, thanks to the remedy signal, their identities were resurfacing. One of them, a tall man with cybernetic vocal cords, stepped forward. "I remember you," he said, voice gravel and static. "You bit the handler who tried to tag your tongue." Another stepped out, a woman with data ports trailing from her neck. "You tore the sedative mask off me when they flooded the pod. I was 5. A third, smaller, hooded, shaking, lifted her hand. "You were the reason I pretended to sleep. I wanted to survive long enough to meet you." Nadia nodded. "I didn't come here to be remembered," she said. "I came to end what started with." The tall man smiled with a hint of awe. "Then what now?" Nadia scanned the treetops. Somewhere far away, satellites still buzzed with the last whispers of the old system. Pockets of resistance would form, others would rise to retake control. The world was not healed, but for the first time, it was waking up. "We build," she said, not from rage, but from memory. The youngest one, barely 15, tilted her head. "What do we build?" "A sanctuary," Nadia replied. "A place for the ones who stayed awake, for those who remember, for those who endure, and for those they never allowed to be born." The others stepped closer. The forest behind them swallowed the lab's final
Exhalation.
and together they walked, not away from war, but toward a kind of peace that had never been permitted. It would not be easy, but neither was Nadia. She was forged in every pain they'd met, and now she was making something new. Freedom.
3 weeks later they had a perimeter, not a fortress. There was no point in defending against ghosts with walls. But the shape of something real had begun to emerge in the northern woods, tucked deep between glacial ravines and shielded by centuries of overgrowth. An old hydroelectric facility, abandoned since the early 90s, became their nucleus. Cracked turbines, hollow stairwells, and mold-rotted bunkers now served a different purpose, rebuilding what had been stolen. They called it Haven, though no one had officially named it. Names were strange things to them. None of them had been born with real ones. Only labels, identifiers, code sequences, scrawled onto wrists or embedded into spines. Nadia still felt hers like a ghost itch sometimes. Subject 23, protocol, pain resistance, status, irregular. But here names started to bloom. The tall man once reduced to Unit 77B specimen reconstructive vocalization now went by Elias. The young girl who'd lived under a chemical fog for most of her life called herself Fawn. She found comfort in soft things, ferns, moss, candlelight, and refused to sleep without the sound of running water. The woman with the spinal ports, who had once been a living computer interface, chose the name Ayunan. She remembered music. She remembered her mother's humming, something that had almost been extracted during a purge but clung to the corners of her mind. They built with salvaged memory. Bricks of trauma, yes, but reinforced with purpose. Elias rewired the solar array. Fawn tended the overgrowth, coaxing plants from poisoned earth. Elun tracked satellite interference, disrupting any signals that might betray their position. And Nadia, she dreamed, not of vengeance, not anymore, but of future things. Shelters for orphans rescued before they could be catalogued. Havens for the ones who never activated. Nodes across continents, invisible but alive, each one a pulse in a network that resisted forgetting. And beneath the turbine chamber, in the cold belly of the earth, Nadia traced these dreams onto old blueprint paper, using thick charcoal and salvaged ink. Lines turned into corridors, boxes became treatment-free recovery chambers. Empty spaces were marked, for the unnamed still coming. Some nights her hands trembled, not from fear, but from remembering the cost of silence. They'd taught her silence was survival, now she used it as resistance. Only in the quiet of Haven could she hear the echoes that truly mattered, names whispered by those who died in labs, whose voices had been wiped, whose bodies had become data, and nothing more. She wrote their names down anyway. Even if they were guesses, even if they were just hopes, even if they would never be confirmed. She wrote them into the corners of her blueprints like holy sigils. Ara, Lenny, Myra, John, Raziel, who are they? Fawn asked one night, curled up beside the oil lamp. Ghosts, Nadia said. Are they angry? They're patient. Fawn nodded and pressed a fern leaf between the pages of her book. Outside, rain pounded on the rusted hull of the hydro facility. Inside, the ghosts were quiet, but not gone, because Nadia wouldn't let them be. She was building a place they could finally rest in, not in peace, but in presence, in acknowledgement, in memory. Every brick, every recalibrated panel, every stitched blanket carried a piece of them. It was slow work, and no one knew how long Haven would last, but it was the most human thing they'd ever done. And for once, being human didn't feel like a vulnerability. It felt like power. And Nadia? She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was architecting a legacy. It began with static, then came the warble, then a voice, not robotic, not disguised, not spliced through algorithmic distortion. A real voice, tired, older, but unmistakable. Project Halcyon is compromised. If you're receiving this, it means I failed to contain them. The voice belonged to Dr. Arlen Varick, the same Varick who had signed Nadia's detainment file, the same Varick who designed the neurological trigger maps that had forced pain to feel like programming, and the same Varick who disappeared 5 years ago when the labs were supposedly shut down. They hadn't shut anything down, they just scattered the data, relocated the experiments, repackaged the monsters under new codenames. And now Varick, once the face of compliance and the ghost of 1,000 children's screams, was calling out from some undisclosed war-torn location through a hacked emergency broadcast frequency. Elun caught it first. She had been monitoring low-bandwidth pulses for signs of drone proximity, but when the signal wormed through a sliver of old Cold War antenna, she froze. She rerouted it through the hydro chamber, and Nadia came running as the voice continued. They're building a new facility. Mobile, underwater, self-sufficient, fully AI integrated. Version 9.3 will not need handlers. You must, static. Then silence. then a second signal, quieter. A whisper buried beneath the noise floor. Coordinates, not precise, but close enough. Latitude, longitude, movement trajectory, not just data, a clue, a warning, a challenge. Nadia stood there in the dark, her jaw clenched, eyes not blinking. She could almost feel the ghosts behind her, gathering at the edges of the room. This wasn't just a new version of the project, it was a rebirth, smarter, cleaner, disconnected from the human mistakes of its predecessors. A system that didn't require cruelty, it optimized it. "We need to go," Ione said quietly. "If they finish that station, there won't be anyone left to fight them." Elias leaned over the map, spreading the transparent overlays Nadia had made of known transport patterns. "They're heading southeast, coastal drop point near the Java Trench. We're looking at a submersible launch." Fawn's voice broke the silence. "So we're going under." Nadia didn't answer. She was already halfway to the archive room, where the weapons weren't guns, where the tools weren't steel, where she'd kept the files no one else was supposed to see. Files smuggled out during the first escape, psych profiles, sensory reaction matrices, sleep deprivation charts, hypoxia adaptation logs. She pulled out the one labeled Prototype X Delta 13, Autonomous Neural Loop Replication. There on the first page was the signature again, Arlen Varick, Dr. Architect, now traitor, or something else, because that message, however fragmented, sounded like remorse, and remorse in their world was rare. "Do you believe him?" Elias asked from the doorway. "No," Nadia said flatly, "but I believe the danger." Fawn crossed her arms, eyes narrow. "What do they want now? We're not even connected to the old grid." "They don't want us," Elone murmured. "They want what's in us. The residuals, the code. Then we make ourselves unusable," Nadia said. A hush fell, because that wasn't just a statement, it was a strategy. If they could corrupt the data embedded in their bodies, if they could taint the experimental archives using their own volatile neural patterns, they could poison the stream. Crash the version 9.3 model before it ever left port. Self-sabotage, Elias whispered. "You're talking about coding infection." Nadia nodded. "We make ourselves into a virus." And so, for the first time since escaping the system, they began planning not just to survive, but to contaminate. Every trauma had left a trace, every induced hallucination, every broken rib, every force-fed delusion. They could map it all, build a mirror, a maze, a Trojan horse, and when the machine tried to replicate them, it would collapse in the reflection, not from strength, but from truth, unfiltered, ugly, unprocessable truth. "We're going to haunt their perfect system," Nadia said, the corner of her mouth twitching into something between a smirk and a grimace. Fawn tilted her head. "How do ghosts haunt a machine? With everything it tried to erase," she replied. By midnight, Haven became a war room, not one of missiles or drones, but of memory. They downloaded their dreams, charted their triggers, extracted their rage in raw waveform, and above it all, Nadia prepared final message. Her voice burned into a corrupted codec file that would automatically beam out the moment 9.3 went live. A message not of revenge, but of reckoning. They weren't anomalies, they weren't glitches, they were the reason the system would fall. And as the last line of the broadcast played again, "You must." Nadia finished it for him, whispering into the dark, "You must stop what you created." And this time, they would. The rooftop extraction point wasn't what Celine expected. No helicopters, no drones, no agents, just static in her ears, and the silent skyline of a dead city. She knelt behind a broken comms relay, eyes scanning the rooftop perimeter. Damaris was already moving, silent, deadly, securing the southwest corner with fluid efficiency. Rain slicked the tiles beneath them, carrying the scent of ozone and rust. The air buzzed with the tension of something unseen. It wasn't over, not yet. They had gotten the drive out of the biometric vault 3 floors below, a small obsidian rectangle, no larger than a deck of cards, but it pulsed with data that could bring the entire ARC network down. Every biometric torture technique, every coded reconditioning pattern, every file on the Pain Points initiative, all of it. Names, locations, neural sync trials, including her own. Celine held the drive close to her chest. It was still warm, alive. Damaris looked over. Extractions burned. They scrubbed it, probably rerouted all secure comms and fried the signals on purpose. Contingency protocol, Celine muttered. They knew we'd come. She was right. The steel doors behind them exploded inward, shredded by a breaching charge, and 3 armored units spilled onto the roof. Silent wardens, elite enforcers under direct control of Chiron's AI. No faces, no voices, just automatic compliance and advanced targeting systems synced to the implants buried in Celine's spine. She didn't run. Instead, she closed her eyes and inhaled. She felt the edge of her mind push against the artificial walls Chiron had installed in her years ago. The neurological firewalls meant to keep her obedient, to block memories, to suppress counter-response impulses. But something had changed. Ever since she'd accessed the encrypted core of the Pain Lab archives 2 days earlier, her neural pathways had started to spark in ways they hadn't before, as if the firewall was fraying. She'd always thought pain was her enemy. Now she understood. It had been a code, and she was ready to rewrite it. The wardens opened fire, their weapons flashing tracer rounds that zipped past her head and dug holes into the rooftop concrete. Damaris rolled across the ground and dropped one of them with 3 clean shots to the neck joint. But the other 2 split apart and flanked them, mechanical, surgical. Celine sprinted forward, not away, but toward the center of their formation, toward the danger. The nearest warden grabbed her by the arm, but before it could engage the electro-lock sequence, she slammed the neural injector she'd concealed in her glove into its synthetic neck. A sharp hiss, and its body convulsed. Blue sparks cracked across its armor. It dropped. The second warden adapted fast, but Celine was faster. She slid low, swept its legs out, and pressed her forehead against its helmet just long enough for the implant in her spine to override its threat protocol. 1 second of contact, 1 override command, whispered like prayer. Its visor flickered. It stopped moving. Damaris stared. I accessed the controller node, Celine said, breathless. Their code was built on my neurological signature. I just took it back. Before Damaris could reply, a new tone echoed from the doorway. A calm, almost seductive voice piped through the remains of a security loudspeaker. Well done, Subject E9, the voice said. But you're not the only one evolving. Celine froze. She knew that voice. Dr. Hayden Kalis. He had designed the pain-based neural mapping system. He had overseen her transformations, and he was supposed to be dead. He'd disappeared years ago, after faking his own sabotage. I watched your progress, he continued. Watched how pain shaped your mind, and I must admit, you exceeded our models. But you're not finished yet, not without the final protocol. Celine grit her teeth. Where are you? Waiting, he said. Where it all began. Sub-level Theta. Below the lab you raided. There's one last firewall between you and the truth. If you dare to breach it, then silence. Celine looked at Damaris. She didn't have to speak. They both knew there would be no rescue, no extraction, just a descent back into the belly of the system that built her. She clipped the obsidian drive to the inside of her belt, and turned toward the stairwell that led back down, toward the man who thought he still controlled her, toward the truth beneath the pain. The final protocol was only rumor, something whispered through encrypted darknets and buried transcripts. A neurological override capable of erasing an operative's mind or unlocking their full latent potential. A kill switch, or a god mode. It's real, he confirmed. And it's encoded using your original pain maps. Without your conscious neural signature, it stays sealed. But unlock it, and you'll control every ARC's asset with an implant. Globally. Damaris stiffened. You want to weaponize her again? No, Kalis said softly. I want her to choose, to become. Celine stared at the screen. The cursor blinked in place, waiting for a biometric trigger. You want me to merge with the very system I came to destroy, she said. I want you to replace it, he replied. This system was always flawed because it needed fear to function. But you've evolved beyond fear. Imagine a neural web of agents who feel no pain, no hesitation, no corruption, because they follow you. Not commands, not code. You. Celine looked down at her palm, still faintly glowing from the door plate. She remembered the chains, the screaming, the mirror room with no escape. She remembered being reduced to a number, a nerve cluster, a test subject. But she also remembered breaking free, fighting back, becoming something more. What happens if I say no? She asked. Kalis shrugged. Then this room collapses, the core burns, and every survivor of Ark's abuses keeps running in the dark, hunted by remnants of a system that refuses to die. And if I say yes, then you kill the system from the inside. Damaris stepped forward. You don't trust him. I don't, Celine said. But I trust the pain. It never lied. She walked up to the console. Kalis stepped back. The cursor blinked. Celine placed her palm on the screen. A surge of heat shot through her arm up her neck, into the implants along her spine. Memories fired like gunshots in her brain. Screams, lights, numbers, her own voice breaking, then silence, and then the descent felt like a burial. Each step down the emergency stairwell echoed like a hammer on a coffin lid. No lights, just a flickering red bulb every few landings, blood-colored, pulsing in rhythm with Celine's rising heart rate. Damaris moved beside her, silent and alert, weapon drawn. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The air grew heavier with each floor passed, like the atmosphere itself thickened the deeper they went, until there was no mistaking it. They were back where it had all begun, sub-level Theta. Not even the Ark's internal maps listed this level anymore. Karen had expunged it years ago, once the Pain Points initiative had gone underground, both figuratively and literally. Celine reached the final steel door. It was sealed as expected, but she didn't reach for tools. Instead, she pulled her glove off and pressed her bare hand against the access plate. Her palm sizzled. Veins glowed faintly through her skin. Then click. The door opened inward with a groan that sounded like 1,000 ghosts weeping. Inside was a wide circular room, bathed in sterile white light from above. It looked cleaner than it should have. Too clean. Like someone had been maintaining it all these years. A surgical theater disguised as a sanctuary. And in the center, standing calmly in front of a console, was Dr. Hayden Kalis. He hadn't aged. Or perhaps he had, but it didn't show. His skin was flawless, his suit unwrinkled, his hands moving with the poise of a pianist over the control interface. Behind him, a massive vertical screen displayed an undulating 3D model of Celine's nervous system live-tracked. You came, he said, not turning around. I wasn't sure you would. But then again, curiosity has always been your flaw, and your arrogance has always been yours. Celine snapped. At this, Kalis finally turned. His eyes were not the eyes of a man. They were too steady, too calm, like nothing could ever hurt him again. Arrogance, he mused. I created the world's most resilient neural weapon. You, Celine, are the culmination of every iteration, every scar, every scream we mapped. And you still walk, still think, still choose. That's not arrogance. That's success. She stepped forward. Damaris remained behind, watching their flanks. You tortured me. I sculpted you. You erased children. I harvested evolution. She took one more step. You turned pain into a language, but I learned how to speak it fluently. You used it to control. I use it to fight back. Kalis smiled faintly. And yet you returned, because you need me. I need nothing from you. Oh, but you do, he said, tapping the console. The screen behind him changed, showing file trees, locked data, schematics. You've seen the drive, but you haven't seen the final protocol. Celine's breath caught. A voice, her own voice, spoken through the speakers in real time. Final protocol accepted. Subject E9. Now primary system override authority. Celine opened her eyes. Kalis bowed his head. For what it's worth, he said. I always knew you'd be the one. Damaris stepped beside her. What now? Celine stared at the screen.
All of ARCS is listening, she said. And I have a new language to teach. The lab was reduced to scorched glass, melted steel, and the low hum of dying machines. Smoke coiled around collapsed corridors like exhausted serpents. Rhea stood barefoot on the fractured tiles, her veins no longer luminous, her pulse slow but steady. The final dose of biosuppressant had worked. The toxin within her, all 47 variants, had been neutralized. But in exchange, she would never be immune again. The power that once made her untouchable was gone, and she had chosen that, not to live, but to remember. Dr. Vask had died in the blast. No one had recovered his body. Some whispered he escaped through the underground aqueduct system. Others said his prototype anti-serum, the one he'd selfishly refused to administer to Rhea, had imploded with him, corrupted by her sabotage. Regardless, the toxin network crumbled without him. The global bio-trafficking web that Vask's syndicate had operated collapsed overnight. Interpol raids uncovered hundreds of sealed storage containers filled with paralyzing agents, memory erasers, synthetic neurotoxins. The black market choked on its own venom. Rhea was brought to an international tribunal in The Hague. She didn't wear a suit or armor, or even a scarf to cover the burn across her neck. She came in civilian clothes, her eyes steady, and voice unshaking. I was their weapon, she said to the panel of judges, but I was also their proof. You ignored this program for decades, because it was hidden behind pharmaceutical licenses and security clearances. You cannot plead ignorance anymore. Not after me. The trial was broadcast globally. Survivors of similar bio-experiments, many once deemed delusional, stepped forward with evidence. The world watched as the hidden war of chemical supremacy was dragged into the light. And with every revelation, Rhea's name became more than whispered legend. It became warning and prayer. She refused compensation, refused exile. She returned to the Arctic Circle, to the ruins of the old station where it had all begun, and rebuilt it not as a lab, but as a haven, a place where no toxin, physical or political, could survive. Scientists, survivors, and volunteers came from all over the world. They called it Bastion 47. Every year on the day the poison had failed to kill her, Rhea would light a single beacon fire over the frozen lake. No speeches, no broadcast, just light in the darkness, a reminder to anyone still fighting behind cold walls or steel tables, that immunity was not invincibility, but truth. Truth could be a cure, and some toxins could only be burned out by those who once carried them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.